Hello, this is David Heine, Aspect Art. We're here today at the Amsterdam Historical Museum. With us today is the curator of their new show, Japanese Amazement, Robert Parthesius. He's going to tell us about the influence that Holland had on Japan. Now, Japan was a closed society in those days. The shogun, due to unrest and religious proselytizing by the Portuguese, kicked them out and allowed the Dutch to stay on a small island near Nagasaki called Dishima. Through this island came all of Japanese contact with the West, and that was all in Netherlands. Through this, they learned perspective, they learned about the scientific developments in the West, which, of course, in the West was called the Age of Enlightenment. So this show focuses primarily on the influence that Holland or the West had on Japan during this period of time. And it uses a single man, Kokan, who was an artist who was very fascinated by the ideas of Western art, perspective, the use of copper etching. They only used woodcuts at the time. And he set out to master these techniques. So join us now at the Amsterdam Historical Museum for Japanese Amazement. Here we are at the Amsterdam Historical Museum for a spectacular new show on more or less the influence of Holland on Japan. Maybe you could tell us a little about the central theme of the exhibition itself.
Well, we call the exhibition Japanese Amazement, and it has to do with actually the effect that small Dutch books and instruments, scientific instruments, had on the Japanese culture. Japanese were amazed about the new things they saw coming in from the West. Japan closed up at the early 17th century in order to keep the stability inside of Japan, and only the Dutch and the Chinese were allowed to have trade with Japan. So over the years, the Dutch were the only way or the only small window to the West for the Japanese. Those books and instruments reached Japan because the shogun wanted to be informed about the rest of the world, and every year the Dutch had to go on an embassy to the shogun and give him that kind of information. So over the years they brought in books about subjects of physics, medicines, well, actually you name it, and those books were brought to Japan. And slowly, those books played their own role in the Japanese culture, because from the shogun it was brought to a small circle of intellectuals within Japan, and that influenced again artists. And one of them was Shiba Kokan, who has an extensive work influenced by the Western culture.
Now, there was actually a group of Japanese scholars that formed around to learn Nederlands. So could you tell us a little about that group?
Yes, well, sorry. The Japanese wanted to control all the information that came into Japan. So they had interpreters. They were trained in Dutch, but they were not scholars. So they actually over the years, they formed the link to that information. In the 18th century, when the rules were less strict and there was a growing interest on strange things from outside Japan, there was a small group of scholars that got access to books, and they needed also the interpreters. So there was a long tradition of asking interpreters to help them to get access to that information. That small group was grown in the big city, Edo, nowadays called Tokyo, because Tokyo, Edo, had gone through a big development in the 17th and 18th century, became a big city with a small group of new rich people, the traditional low the low groups in the society were able to earn a lot of money by building palaces for all the local rulers that had to stay in Edo for a long time. Traders become rich, and around that new culture, that's called the floating world, new interests were rising, and also intellectuals were able to get access to books and other cultural things.
Now, the artist that you've used as your central protagonist for this exhibition, Kokan, could you tell us a little about him? He was part of that floating world, wasn't he?
Yes, he was from the lower groups in the society, but he was very eager to become famous. So he was looking for a form of art that would make him famous. So he started in the traditional way of making Japanese woodblock cuts. But that was actually not enough for him. In his early work, you see already that he got a kind of interest in different things that were possible with the new ideas about art from the West. In the small books the Dutch brought in, you see a lot of etching and engravings. There's a new technique for Japan which makes it possible to make finer work instead of the rougher woodcut. But what's more important, they also saw the use of perspective. In Japan, they suggested perspective by putting things on top of each other or below something else. And in the new way of perspective, Kokan saw a way of actually depicting the reality in a more natural way than was done before. So that was his first step, actually, his search for art that would help him to depict the reality more on a more natural way, but also to become famous. His first step was going to the new Chinese art. We have a small collection of his earlier work in the Chinese tradition. That was also already modern for Japan at that stage. And there he met one of the scholars in Edo, that was a painter in the Chinese style. And from that group he got access to actually the Western scholars, the scholars in Western art. And from there he developed his traditional Western art.
I know the Japanese used a kind of watercolor primarily, or aquarelle. Did he also introduce new materials that might have been more from the West?
Yes, so first thing he did was, again with the help of a translator, to reinvent for Japan the technique of engraving and etching. So that was a completely new technique in that age, of that time. So that was his first step, and after that he started to use oil painting. That was a new technique, which was used, but not in the same way as we use it in the West.
The Japanese were primarily concerned with keeping the Dutch on a small island so that it wouldn't be disruptive to their society. Every year, as you said, they went on an annual pilgrimage to the Shogun. During that pilgrimage, were they allowed to have any interaction with the Japanese themselves?
Well, they tried to keep as minimum as possible. So what you see in this exhibition, we have a corner where we show the embassy, the way going to the shogun. They actually were carried around what's the English name for it? Pelicans. And so the contact between Japan and the Japanese and the Dutch were minimum. But over the years it became more and more traditional that when they come in the city they could meet they should meet the local rulers, but around the local rulers there were more and more people interested in the Dutch tradition. So the group was extending more and more. We have one image in the exhibition where you see the Dutch, when they arrived in Edo, they should stay in a special inn, the Nagasaki Inn, and higher intellectuals and local rulers were allowed to visit them. But the normal people had to stay outside and have looking through the windows to see a glimpse. But it was a kind of tourist attraction. It should be a sign saying, oh, here are the red hair Westerns or strangers. So you see in a little image all those Japanese people waiting to see a glimpse of the people from the West.
Now, what was the real big difference between in the intellectual thought in the West and the East at that time?
Well, we had, of course, the Enlightenment in Europe, so we were really busy in actually opening up all kind of machines or constructing machines, looking into bodies in order to understand how things work. And in Japan, the outside and the inside were still very much connected, so there was no need of actually opening up things and finding out what the exact construction is. As long as the whole was working, then it was okay. Striking examples, of course, the medical science is where we opening up people and repairing people. In Japan, they still use the Chinese method of keeping a body in balance in order to keep the outside and the inside healthy.
Now, getting back to the floating world, what exactly was that, and how did it work in Japanese culture?
Well, at the early 17th century, when they closed up Japan, they had a long period of internal wars before, and the shogun managed to actually control the whole situation by saying to people, listen, we're going to move the traditional political center from Kyoto to Edo. Edo was a small town at that stage, or even a village. And he forced everybody to stay at his court for most of the year, and if they want to travel back to their region, they had to leave behind their family as a kind of hostage. And so actually they had to build a complete new city with palaces and courts that has to be maintained and feed. So what you see, so they had to stay for the main period of the year. They have to stay at Edo, and all those palaces has to be built, and the courts has to be maintained. So there is a group of traditional lower class people, the traders and the merchants, who became all of a sudden very rich, and they had no possibility to step up on this social ladder. So they had to use their money for a new culture, and that's the culture of the big town, in which that's why it's called floating world, in which they actually were seeking maximum comfort with their money. So there were a lot of cultural life in the sense of theaters, and brothels were very popular as a place where you could meet all kind of people. It's not the brothel in our sense of the word now. It was more a social meeting place where they could also meet people they normally wouldn't meet in normal life. So that was a very massive culture in that big city. There was over 1 million in the 17th and 18th century people living in Edo. So it was a very big city at that time, which actually gave the feeding for the starting point for the interest in the West.
Kokan made a big trip across Japan, and maybe this helped influence Japanese thought about the West. Could you talk a little about that pilgrimage of his?
Yes. Well, to my opinion, his first pilgrimage was to seek the techniques of the West, so the painting techniques and the etching techniques. That was his first journey. But of course, he was so inspired that he wanted to see the Dutch, and actually he went to Decima to find actually a teacher that could help him to refine his techniques. So at the end of the 18th century, in 1788, he decided to leave his wife and children and actually to go on his journey to the West, best being Decima. Traveling in Japan was not a normal thing. Every day, every time you have to move from one city to another city, you need to have permits and special papers, official letters. And Kokan seemed to be very successful in operating on a social level. So being from the lower classes, he had first access to that scholars in Edo, and later, when he started traveling, he was able every time that he could his official letters and permits again. And he described it himself that the best success he had was with showing his Western art. He made already some etchings, and he built a optica instrument, which was a new way of looking to prints and seeing perspective in a very different way. So he was I imagine that he every town he comes, he right away went to the local ruler and said, "Oh, I'm here, I'm Kokon, and I have something interesting to show you." And then he showed his world map and saying, "Oh, the world is not flat, it's round. Look here." And so it was I think a kind of a theater man, giving his shows also to the local people. He gives shows and earns some money. And in the exhibition we have some examples of paintings he made during his journey, just on a social level. So he's one rich merchant that welcomed him twice, and he made a portrait of him. Another example is that sometimes when he was at a dinner, when he was invited, people said, "Oh, Mr. Kokon, you're such a good painter. Can you please do something like a pianist? Can you play us some music, please?" And he painted this, in this case, a kingfisher. And so I think he operated very smoothly on the social level. And so he made his way to Nagasaki, to Deshima. But then the big disappointment was that he first had to go through a lot of trouble to get access to the island. He finally managed to dress him up as a merchant and get a special permit to go onto the island. But secondly, he couldn't find a teacher because, well, the Dutch East India Company normally didn't ship teachers in painting to their trading post in the east.
Speaking of the Dutch, they had a profound influence on Japan, but what did the Japanese really think of the Dutch? Because they were really their only exposure they had to Europeans.
Well, being very busy with Kokon, and he was really admiring the Western people. It's more broader than only the Dutch, of course. But since we were the people bringing in the information, we were identified as as the Dutch as being European. But he was really impressed about, well, apart from the art we brought, but also what he read about our social structure. Having hospitals in Europe was something very extraordinary, that we would help disabled people, and that children were even allowed to correct their parents. It's not a reality, but that's what was living in his head about the West. But in general, we must, of course, realize that most of the Japanese never heard of that there were strangers in their country. And if they saw them, they were so encapsulated from their society that they must have been like people from Mars. That's why we all see, well, actually here you see one that's all with red hair and actually very strange image of us.
Do you think they all had red hair that went out there, or was that just a generalization?
Well, of course, we have archives saying that we only selected red-haired people. No, of course not. No. They no. And maybe it's just an image of having large people. And since red hair is very distinctive, still people are having strange ideas of people with red hair, isn't it? So I think they picked out that image as an icon for all the Western people. And they have very sharp nose. And you see actually when they got more access to each other, to the different cultures, you see more realistic image developing.
Robert, could you tell us how long will the exhibition be here, and when can the people come and see it?
Well, it will be open till the 4th of June, so then we're closing down, and we open every day, of course, from 10 o'clock. And there's something interesting also to report about this. We got a lot of loans from Japan, and some of them are very unique, but also very vulnerable. That means that they can't be on show the whole time. So a lot of artwork we have to change half period. Then it has to go back to Japan, and new artwork will come in. So actually we have 2 exhibitions. First now from now till half April, and after half April we have a change in artwork and have the second period.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
You're welcome.